In the quaint Sydney suburb of Epping live the Glockemanns. Despite being honourable and well-to-do Australian citizens, 2 generations of Glockemanns were interned as enemy aliens in Australian camps during the First and the Second World War. The first was Rudolf Schneider, a successful businessman and father of 4.
My grandfather came to Australia at the age of 18 or 19, became prosperous so that he could marry quite well and buy a beautiful mansion in Mossman, Sydney, which still stands, and was a prominent Australian citizen. He was naturalised in 1895. The only problem was that he tended to be in the German community, a German-speaking community. That was his social group, the German community, and this led him into the work that he was doing, which was trading with the South Sea Islands, mainly the German colonies, New Guinea, Samoa, all the Bougainville, all these German colonies before the First World War. They needed all their supplies from Australia, and there were a number of companies, I believe even Australian companies, that traded with these colonies. At the start of World War I, all German companies in Australia were shut down immediately. My grandfather, clever man, he said, well, I'm Australian. The companies, the German colonies, even whether they were occupied by Australian soldiers or not, they still needed their supplies from Australia, and I have the contacts with these colonies. So he asked the federal government for permission to trade with the enemy, quite legally, until a newspaper, a Sydney newspaper, discovered that a German was trading with the enemy. In fact, I think embarrassing the government by the strength of the wording to allow a German to trade with the Germans. The fact that he was naturalised, it didn't count in those days, apparently. You know, if you were German, you were German.
Nationality had always been an imprecise concept in Australia, and the young nation felt easily threatened. In World War I, some 7,000 men were incarcerated in 12 so-called concentration camps across Australia. All but a few hundred were deported to Europe a year after the First World War had ended, without their Australian families. Richard Schneider, who had retained some funds and possibly had good political connections, was able to remain in Sydney. One of his Australian-born daughters married an immigrant from Germany.
My father came to Australia in 1925, which was the earliest that Germans were allowed to come to Australia after the First World War. And he came to Sydney to work for his uncle, who had a wool-broking business in Sydney. I was born in Sydney, in the eastern suburbs in Vaucluse. Ordinary little Australian boy. I knew no German whatsoever.
1939, at the outbreak of war, on the 3rd of September, all members of the Nazi Party in Australia were arrested immediately, within 1 or 2 days. They were all arrested because they were so proud of being Nazis, and everybody knew they were Nazis. Right? Then all the remaining German nationals had to be registered. They had to register.
Before the war, we got on extremely well with all our neighbours. It was no problem, you know. And then suddenly, after the war started, the neighbours turned nasty. It was like everybody had to prove how patriotic they were.
Unlike in the First World War, Australian camps in the Second World War housed whole families. Some 14,000 civilians from more than 30 countries were arrested on the basis of heritage and to appease public opinion. More than a third of the internees were Australian-born or naturalised British subjects, or they had lived in Australia for most of their lives. Additionally, large numbers of women and children were deported from British overseas protectorates such as Palestine, Iran, Malaysia and New Guinea for the sole purpose of being interned in Australia.
When the war got a little bit more serious, when Germans were having victories in the Middle East, the English government decided to deport or move the German population or the German settlers in Palestine, in the former Turkish Palestine, which was a British mandate after the First World War, which meant that anybody living there kept their nationality.
My father was born in Haifa, my mother was born in Jerusalem, and I was born in Sarona, Tel Aviv. We were told we had to leave Palestine because we were enemy alien. At that time we didn't know where we were being taken to. Some people thought it could be South Africa, some people thought it could be Canada, and we ended up in Australia, in Tatura, near Shepparton, Seymour, Victoria. And there we were from August 41 till we were released January 1947.
I can remember going into this camp and we're standing there and a group, well, it seemed like a crowd of people surrounded us and they're all talking German, and I didn't know what the heck is going on. I didn't have a word of German, and they were all looking at us as curiosities. You know, we were Australian Germans. This was a novelty, sort of.
It was easier for children to be interned for 6 years. Was a long time, particularly for parents, because they didn't know what was going to happen at the end of the war. They knew they couldn't go back to Palestine. They lost everything, what was going to happen, the uncertainty, how long were we going to be interned. And but for children, I only have very happy memories of camp.
We got along famously with the guards. In fact, we used to get a lot of stuff sent out through the Red Cross from Germany, which included a lot of cigarettes. And well, nobody in my family smoked, for example. So our ration of cigarettes, we would go and flog them to the guards to get real Australian money. Because in camp, we had token money. We didn't have real money. So we flogged this stuff to the guards and got real money. And then the older boys used to nick out of camp, go walk to the nearest town, to Rushworth, and buy ice cream and batteries. That's what you did with this real money. And looking back, I'm sure the people in the town must have known. I mean, these kids could hardly speak English, you know. But it was all, who cares, you know? I mean, God, it was so, you know, what are you going to do, you know?
We had all the German Feiertag, what do you call it, the festivals, the German festivals, the Tag der Machtergreifung, you know, when Hitler came to power on 30th of January. There was always marching up. There was the Hitler Youth, the Pimpfen, you know, the Jungvolk, that's the ones underneath it, up to the age of 14.
From today's point of view, certainly. I mean, we were raving Nazis, good heavens, you know. I couldn't wait to get into the Hitler Youth. And I finally made it. I got to a couple of years, I became 10, and then I got into the Jungvolk. Wow, that was terrific, you know. We were in a camp that had 4 compounds, A, B, C, and D. And D compound, well, the compounds were separated from each other, and in the D compound were Australian Germans and sort of German Jews mostly.
These were interesting people. These Jews had fled Germany in the 1930s. They'd left Germany because of the feeling, but they weren't strictly religious Jews. They weren't, in effect, accepted by the Jewish community in Australia. So they were suspect, and they were put away when the war started.
I think we had riots with the Jews.
The Nazis from the other compounds taunted the Jews through the barbed wire. There were taunts, and the Jews taunted back, and then the German youths started to climb over the wires, and I believe they did climb over the wire, and there was some krawall, you know, some problems. But it didn't take long before the Jews were then released, and that all 4 compounds were together. In fact, the Jews were released in order to allow the missionaries, the German missionaries from New Guinea, to join us.
While internees tried to retain a sense of purpose and identity, what they perceived as German language and culture was their very own interpretation. The education and the ideas of those who had actually experienced fascist Germany became thoroughly mixed with German settlers' 19th century language and customs, as well as with newer Australian and Middle Eastern traditions.
In Palestine we spoke Schwäbisch. Im Lager war alles in Deutsch, in Schwäbisch. And at home we always spoke German. My father insisted that we should speak German at home.
We had a lot of, for instance, Arabic words in our German, which I always thought were German words until after the war I found in fact they weren't German words. Especially a lot of foods had Arabic names. Peanuts are fustuk, and rockmelons are shamam, watermelons are batir, and so on. And a lot of the men in camp, when they swore in Arabic. And oh yeah, we also learnt to swear in Arabic, yeah.
And then, of course, when Hitler then died, this was, a couple of days before the war ended, we had a big Trauerfest, a big, a wake. We had a Hitler portrait about that big with black crepe around it, and everybody was just, shocked, just absolutely faltered. Then, of course, the war ended, and then the military came in. No more Nazi. It's finished. Everything's got to go. Everything's got to go. And we did.
Some internees, when they were released, went to Germany, but most stayed in Australia.
And I actually went to some older people who had been in camp and asked them what were their feelings. And they told me, they were absolutely shattered, because this was the second time in their life that their life had sort of been wiped away. They had to start from zero twice.
I was very insecure when I came out of camp. Having sort of lived in such a sheltered environment for so long, and then all of a sudden coming to Sydney, it took me a long time to adjust to not living in camp anymore.
Consequently, Brigitte and her sister later married the brothers Glockemann. Their childhood experiences in camp remain a subject of conversation for them to this very day. Most European prisoners had no choice but to stay in Australia. Asians were mostly deported. Internees were never compensated for any loss or their time in confinement.